Picture this. It's December 2026, and the Philippines finds itself more isolated than ever in the turbulent waters of the South China Sea. Former allies who once stood with Manila against Chinese aggression are now conspicuously silent. Trade partners who promised mutual prosperity have quietly shifted toward Beijing's orbit. And the superpower that once guaranteed our security is distracted by its own global chess game. This isn't fiction. It's the harsh reality emerging from the perfect storm of shifting global priorities, economic desperation, and China's relentless expansion in our backyard. As major powers reshape their foreign policy priorities and allies scramble to protect their own interests, the Philippines stands at a crossroads that could define our sovereignty for generations. The numbers tell a stark story. In January 2026, 12 nations maintained formal diplomatic support for Philippine territorial claims in the South China Sea. By December, that number had dropped to just 3. The silence speaks volumes. From the bustling remittance centers in Manila, where overseas Filipino workers send billions home, to the fishing communities in Palawan watching foreign vessels patrol waters. Their grandfathers once fished freely. These geopolitical shifts hit close to home. These aren't just diplomatic spats in distant capitals. They're decisions that affect every Filipino family with relatives abroad, every business dependent on international trade, and every citizen who believes in our territorial rights. Today, on Discovering the Earth, we examine the painful reality of international relations. When push comes to shove, nations choose self-interest over solidarity. These are the top 10 countries that turned their backs on the Philippines in 2026. Number 10, Canada. Canada's betrayal feels particularly cold because of how warm the relationship once was. For decades, Ottawa stood as one of our most reliable supporters in international forums, consistently backing Philippine positions on South China Sea disputes and welcoming hundreds of thousands of Filipino immigrants who helped build modern Canada. The relationship seemed unshakable. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau personally condemned Chinese militarization of disputed reefs during his 2024 Manila visit. Canadian naval vessels participated in freedom of navigation operations alongside Philippine ships. The two nations shared intelligence on Chinese Coast Guard movements and coordinated responses to maritime incidents. Then came the economic shockwaves of 2026. When global trade tensions escalated dramatically, Canada faced a brutal choice. Traditional export markets in the United States became increasingly unreliable due to protectionist policies and tariff wars. Canadian lumber, steel, and energy sectors, backbone industries employing hundreds of thousands, desperately needed alternative buyers. China offered exactly what Canada needed: guaranteed long-term contracts, stable pricing, and expanded market access worth $85 billion annually. The pivot happened swiftly and quietly. Where Canada once joined international statements criticizing Chinese territorial expansion, 2026 saw diplomatic silence. The Canadian Navy, which conducted joint exercises with Philippine forces just 18 months earlier, redirected its Pacific operations northward to Arctic sovereignty issues, conveniently avoiding any operations that might irritate Beijing. For the 850,000 Filipinos calling Canada home, this shift creates profound uncertainty. Immigration quotas tightened as Ottawa prioritized Chinese investment over historical Filipino migration patterns. The irony cuts deep. A country built by immigrants choosing Beijing's economic promises over Manila's friendship, abandoning the very values that once made Canada attractive to Filipino families seeking better lives. Number 9, Australia. Down under, the land of ANZUS treaties and Quad partnerships, Australia's 2026 retreat from Philippine solidarity represents one of the year's most stunning geopolitical reversals. Just 18 months earlier, Australian warships sailed alongside Philippine vessels in disputed waters, demonstrating unified resistance to Chinese expansion. The partnership had deep roots. Australia provided military training for Philippine Special Forces, shared satellite intelligence on Chinese reef construction, and offered diplomatic backing for Manila's legal challenges to Beijing's territorial claims. Australian Defence Minister Richard Marles declared in 2025 that Philippine sovereignty is Australian security. Those words ring hollow now. The shift began with domestic political upheaval. Rising energy costs dominated Australia's federal politics as households faced utility bills that doubled within 12 months. The Labour government, facing electoral annihilation, needed immediate economic solutions. China, Australia's largest trading partner with $220 billion in annual commerce, offered irresistible deals, guaranteed iron ore purchases for the next decade, expanded LNG contracts, and critical mineral cooperation that promised to revive Australian mining towns. Australia's about-face became apparent during the June 2026 Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, where Canberra's defense minister conspicuously avoided mentioning Philippine territorial rights while announcing expanded practical cooperation with Beijing. The joint Australian-Philippine patrols that once challenged Chinese Coast Guard vessels simply vanished from operational schedules, replaced by what officials euphemistically called recalibrated regional engagement. For the 400,000 Filipino-Australians watching this unfold, the betrayal stings personally. Many migrated specifically because Australia represented Western democratic values and opposition to authoritarian expansion. Now they watch their adopted homeland accommodate the same power threatening their birthplace, choosing economic pragmatism over the principles that once made Australia a beacon for Filipino migrants. Number 8. Germany. Germany's abandonment of Philippine positions reveals how European Union fractures cascade across global partnerships, creating diplomatic aftershocks felt thousands of miles from Brussels. Berlin once provided consistent diplomatic support for Manila's territorial claims, viewing South China Sea freedom as essential for global trade routes that carry German exports worth 1.6 trillion euros annually. The relationship had genuine substance. German technical expertise helped modernize Philippine Coast Guard capabilities. German diplomats authored European Union statements condemning Chinese interference with Filipino fishing vessels. Chancellor Olaf Scholz personally met with President Marcos Jr. in 2025, promising unwavering support for rules-based maritime order. And then economic reality intervened brutally. The 2026 shift began with Germany's constitutional debt brake crisis, which limited government spending just as the economy contracted by 2.8%. Facing potential recession, Scholz's government confronted impossible choices: maintain expensive international commitments or prioritize domestic survival. China, representing 30% of German automotive sales and crucial for green energy technology, offered attractive alternatives to struggling European markets. Germany's retreat manifested in international forums where Berlin previously backed Philippine positions without hesitation. At the International Maritime Organization, German representatives began abstaining from resolutions condemning Chinese interference with Filipino fishing vessels, citing complexity and need for balanced approaches. European Union statements on South China Sea issues became noticeably weaker after German diplomatic intervention behind closed doors. The industrial implications run deeper than diplomatic votes. Germany's advanced submarine technology, once discussed for potential Philippine defense cooperation, now flows exclusively to Chinese shipyards through joint venture agreements. BMW and Mercedes-Benz expanded Chinese operations by 35%, while reducing Southeast Asian investments, symbolizing broader European accommodation of Chinese economic power. For the 25,000 Filipinos working in Germany's healthcare and engineering sectors, this pivot creates visa uncertainties and reduced advocacy from German authorities when facing workplace discrimination or legal challenges, precisely when their homeland needs international support most. Number 7. France. France's retreat from Philippine solidarity represents the collapse of what seemed like natural partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. Both nations share histories of resistance to foreign domination, democratic transitions, and concerns about authoritarian expansion in their respective regions. French President Emmanuel Macron once declared the Indo-Pacific France's backyard, suggesting permanent commitment to regional security and maritime law. The partnership had impressive scope. France provided advanced radar systems for Philippine maritime surveillance, shared intelligence on Chinese submarine movements, and offered diplomatic backing for Manila's international legal challenges. French naval vessels conducted high-profile freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea in 2024 and 2025, explicitly supporting Philippine territorial claims against Chinese expansion. The betrayal began with France's domestic political earthquake. Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, emboldened by populist movements worldwide, demanded France First policies that prioritized European interests over global commitments. Macron, weakened by massive protests over pension reforms and facing potential electoral defeat, couldn't resist pressure for geopolitical retrenchment. Public opinion polls showed 68% of French citizens opposed military involvement in distant Asian disputes. China skillfully exploited this opening, offering France exclusive partnerships worth 45 billion euros in nuclear energy technology and rare earth mineral processing. When Chinese corporations acquired majority stakes in French lithium processing facilities essential for electric vehicle production, Beijing gained leverage over European green energy transitions. France simply couldn't afford to alienate such crucial partners over territorial disputes 8,000 miles from Paris. The diplomatic retreat became obvious through conspicuous absence. French naval vessels, which conducted freedom of navigation operations through disputed waters with great fanfare just months earlier, mysteriously disappeared from 2026 patrol schedules. French diplomats at the United Nations began abstaining from resolutions supporting Philippine territorial claims, citing complexity and need for inclusive dialogue. The cultural betrayal stings particularly for educated Filipinos who admired French intellectual traditions and democratic values. France's soft power influence in Southeast Asia, built through decades of educational exchanges and cultural programs, now serves Chinese interests as French institutions avoid criticizing Beijing's regional ambitions to protect their expanded Chinese funding. Number 6. South Korea. Seoul's 2026 pivot away from Philippine solidarity showcases how economic desperation can override shared democratic values and mutual security interests in the harsh calculus of international relations. South Korea and the Philippines seemed like natural partners, both U.S. treaty allies facing authoritarian neighbors, both depending on American security guarantees, both deeply committed to rules-based international order. The partnership had genuine momentum. South Korean companies invested $8.2 billion in Philippine infrastructure projects, while Korean cultural products, from K-pop to Korean dramas, dominated Filipino entertainment markets. Korean technical expertise helped modernize Philippine telecommunications and electronics manufacturing. Seoul consistently supported Manila's positions in international forums, viewing Chinese expansion as a shared threat to regional democracy. Then the economic hammer fell. The betrayal began when global trade tensions devastated South Korea's export-dependent economy. Korean electronics and automotive exports, which comprise 45% of the nation's GDP, faced punitive tariffs and market restrictions worldwide. Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, pillars of Korean prosperity, threatened massive layoffs unless the government secured alternative markets immediately. Unemployment spiked to 7.8%, the highest level since the 1997 Asian financial crisis. China provided the economic lifeline Seoul desperately needed. Beijing offered preferential access for Korean technology companies, guaranteed purchases of Korean cultural products worth $28 billion over 3 years, and expanded tourist flows that had been restricted during previous diplomatic tensions. The comprehensive package totaled $150 billion in trade commitments, impossible to refuse given Korea's economic emergency. South Korea's diplomatic retreat became evident during ASEAN summit meetings, where Korean representatives avoided supporting Philippine positions on territorial disputes, instead emphasizing regional stability and peaceful dialogue. Joint military exercises between Korean and Philippine forces, enthusiastically planned throughout 2025, were quietly cancelled without public explanation. The North Korean dimension complicates everything tragically. As Kim Jong-un's regime intensifies nuclear provocations and missile tests, Seoul desperately needs Chinese cooperation for any diplomatic resolution. Supporting Philippine challenges to Chinese territorial authority risks Beijing's retaliation on the Korean peninsula, potentially destabilizing the entire Northeast Asian security environment. Number 5. Pakistan. Pakistan's 2026 pivot away from Philippine solidarity represents a betrayal rooted in decades of strategic miscalculation and alliance building that prioritizes regional survival over distant partnerships. While Pakistan never formally positioned itself as a Philippine ally, Islamabad's growing influence in Southeast Asian affairs through Islamic cooperation networks and its permanent seat at the United Nations created implicit expectations of mutual support among smaller nations facing great power pressure. The relationship had ideological foundations. Pakistan historically championed the rights of developing nations against colonial powers and superpower interference, positions that seemingly aligned with Philippine struggles for territorial sovereignty. Pakistani diplomats consistently advocated for maritime rights of smaller states, viewing such advocacy as fundamental to the developing world's resistance against neo-colonial domination. Yet in 2026, those principles evaporated under economic pressure. The betrayal became apparent when Pakistan abandoned its historical advocacy for maritime rights of developing nations in international forums. At the International Maritime Organization and United Nations, Pakistani voting patterns shifted dramatically toward supporting Chinese positions on maritime governance and territorial disputes, abandoning decades of principled advocacy for smaller nations' sovereign rights. The driver behind this reversal is brutally straightforward: Pakistan's economic desperation and China's strategic chokehold through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. China extended Pakistan a massive $62 billion CPEC expansion involving upgraded infrastructure projects, enhanced military cooperation, and guaranteed markets for Pakistani agricultural products and textiles. Facing potential sovereign debt default and International Monetary Fund pressure, Islamabad couldn't afford to alienate its only reliable economic benefactor, Pakistan's military establishment, historically the nation's most influential institution, intensified its alignment with Beijing systematically. Chinese defense contractors expanded operations in Pakistan's defense manufacturing sector, while Pakistani military officers received advanced training exclusively from Chinese instructors rather than traditional Western sources. Joint Pakistani-Chinese naval exercises in the Arabian Sea became the region's most frequent military drills, replacing Pakistani participation in international maritime security operations. The diplomatic betrayal manifested through Pakistan's conspicuous silence during international forums discussing South China Sea territorial disputes. Pakistani diplomats, once vocal advocates for developing nations' rights against powerful neighbors, began abstaining from or actively voting against resolutions supporting Philippine territorial claims. When Manila specifically requested Pakistan's support for strengthening international maritime law enforcement, Islamabad deferred the matter to ASEAN, effectively abandoning its traditional role as a voice for marginalized nations. Number 4. Vietnam. Perhaps no betrayal stings more than Vietnam's 2026 abandonment of Philippine solidarity in the South China Sea. Both nations share identical challenges: overlapping Chinese territorial claims over their exclusive economic zones, systematic harassment of fishing vessels, and ongoing militarization of disputed reefs by Chinese forces. Vietnamese and Philippine Coast Guard forces cooperated extensively for years, sharing intelligence and coordinating responses to Chinese aggression. The partnership had deep practical roots. Vietnamese and Filipino fishermen faced identical threats from Chinese Coast Guard vessels that rammed their boats, confiscated equipment, and arrested crews in disputed waters. Both nations filed formal protests against Chinese reef construction and artificial island building. Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh personally assured President Marcos Jr. in 2025 that Vietnam stands with the Philippines against any maritime aggression. Those assurances proved worthless when economic reality intervened. The turning point came with China's massive infrastructure investment package offered to Vietnam in early 2026. Facing severe economic pressure from global trade disruptions and urgent domestic development needs, Hanoi couldn't resist Beijing's comprehensive $200 billion commitment to Vietnamese manufacturing modernization, transportation networks, and energy sector development. The deal included guaranteed Chinese purchases of Vietnamese agricultural products and textiles, replacing traditional markets disrupted by global trade wars. Vietnam's diplomatic retreat manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. Joint Vietnamese-Philippine protests against Chinese reef construction and militarization activities ceased abruptly without public explanation. Vietnamese media coverage of South China Sea disputes became noticeably more neutral, avoiding direct criticism of Chinese actions while emphasizing peaceful resolution through bilateral negotiations rather than international law enforcement. Vietnamese representatives at ASEAN meetings began echoing Chinese talking points about outside interference in regional maritime affairs, directly contradicting previous Vietnamese positions supporting international arbitration and multilateral dispute resolution mechanisms. When the Philippines requested Vietnamese support for joint Coast Guard patrols in disputed areas, Hanoi declined, citing domestic priorities and resource limitations. The historical irony runs deeper than diplomatic convenience. Vietnam's thousand-year resistance to Chinese domination once inspired Filipino independence movements during the colonial period. Vietnamese victories against foreign occupation provided hope for Filipino revolutionaries fighting Spanish and American rule. Now economic necessity forces Vietnam to accommodate the same power it fought for generations, abandoning maritime solidarity with fellow victims of Chinese territorial expansion. For Filipino businesses operating in Vietnam's expanding manufacturing sector, this diplomatic shift creates immediate operational challenges as Vietnamese authorities become noticeably less cooperative in trade disputes involving Chinese competitors or in providing regulatory support for Filipino investment projects. Number 3. Japan. Tokyo's 2026 retreat from Philippine partnership represents the collapse of what many considered the cornerstone of democratic resistance to Chinese expansion in East Asia. Japan's self-defense forces conducted regular joint exercises with Philippine military units. Japanese Coast Guard vessels patrolled alongside Filipino counterparts, and Tokyo provided over $3 billion in development aid for Philippine infrastructure projects throughout the past decade. The alliance seemed unbreakable. Japan's pacifist constitution limited military options, but Tokyo maximized diplomatic, economic, and technological support for Philippine sovereignty. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida declared in 2025 that Philippine security is Japanese security, reflecting genuine strategic alignment between Asia's established democracy and its emerging one. Yet even this partnership crumbled under pressure. The betrayal began with mounting pressure from the United States demanding that Japan pay significantly more for American military presence or face potential base closures and reduced security guarantees. Tokyo confronted an impossible choice: dramatically increase defense spending while managing recession, or find accommodation with regional powers including China. Simultaneously, China, Japan's largest trading partner at $350 billion annually, offered expanded market access and crucial technology cooperation in exchange for diplomatic restraint on territorial issues. Japan's policy shift became evident during territorial incidents throughout 2026. When Chinese vessels repeatedly rammed Philippine fishing boats near Scarborough Shoal, Japan's response was notably muted, a dramatic departure from previous strong statements supporting Philippine territorial rights. Japanese companies began reducing investments in Philippine energy projects, while quietly expanding operations in Chinese manufacturing zones and technology parks. The cultural dimension amplifies this betrayal significantly. Millions of Filipinos admire Japanese technology, work ethic, and post-war democratic transformation as models for Philippine development. Many Filipino workers in Japan's automotive and electronics industries view their employment as representing shared values of innovation, quality, and peaceful progress. Japan's diplomatic retreat undermines these cultural bonds and suggests that economic interests ultimately trump democratic solidarity. Historical echoes make this particularly painful for older Filipinos. Japan's World War II occupation of the Philippines was followed by decades of careful reconciliation and partnership building based on shared democratic values and mutual respect. The 2026 accommodation of Chinese power feels like abandoning the democratic principles that enabled Japanese-Philippine friendship to flourish after decades of historical trauma. For the 280,000 Filipino workers in Japan, this diplomatic pivot creates immediate personal consequences. Japanese immigration authorities become less supportive during visa renewals and work permit applications. Labor disputes involving Filipino workers receive reduced government advocacy. The message becomes clear: when Japan needs Chinese economic cooperation, Filipino interests become expendable. Number 2. United States. The United States occupies second place not because its betrayal was less significant, but because it was less surprising given clear warning signs throughout 2025. America's retreat from Philippine security commitments represents the most consequential geopolitical shift of 2026, fundamentally altering regional power dynamics and forcing every Southeast Asian nation to recalculate their strategic positions. The alliance had survived multiple challenges across decades. Through regime changes, economic crises, and shifting global priorities, the Mutual Defense Treaty signed in 1951 remained the cornerstone of Philippine security planning. American military bases provided training and equipment. American diplomats backed Philippine positions in international forums. American naval forces conducted regular freedom of navigation operations, challenging Chinese territorial claims. Yet by December 2026, that foundation had crumbled. The retreat began with explicit policy announcements prioritizing domestic concerns over international partnerships. The new administration declared that mutual defense treaty obligations would be renegotiated to ensure fair burden sharing and reciprocal benefits. This bureaucratic language masked fundamental policy shifts, drastically reduced funding for joint military exercises, delayed delivery of promised military equipment worth $2.8 billion, and elimination of regular freedom of navigation operations that directly challenged Chinese territorial expansion. America's pivot toward isolationist policies became starkly evident during the February 2026 crisis when Chinese Coast Guard vessels blockaded Philippine supply missions to Second Thomas Shoal for 6 consecutive days. Previous incidents of this magnitude triggered immediate American diplomatic protests, naval deployments, and high-level phone calls demanding Chinese withdrawal. This time, the State Department issued a perfunctory statement calling for restraint by all parties, while American naval forces remained conspicuously absent from the disputed area. The economic dimension compounds the security retreat significantly. New trade policies disrupted established patterns that benefited both nations for generations. Philippine agricultural exports faced 20% American tariffs ostensibly designed to protect domestic farmers, while Chinese agricultural products received preferential treatment through bilateral negotiations. Filipino-American remittances, totaling $35 billion annually and representing the lifeline for millions of Filipino families, became vulnerable to banking restrictions and currency manipulation policies designed to reduce trade deficits. For the 4 million Filipino Americans comprising the second-largest Asian American community, this represents profound personal betrayal. Many families immigrated specifically because America represented democratic values, rule of law, and opposition to authoritarianism. Watching their adopted homeland abandon their birthplace while accommodating Chinese expansion creates deep identity conflicts and questions about American commitment to its founding principles. The strategic implications extend far beyond bilateral Philippine-American relations. American retreat signals to every Southeast Asian ally that security guarantees are conditional and temporary, encouraging accommodation of Chinese power rather than resistance. This cascade effect amplifies throughout the region as nations conclude that American protection cannot be trusted during critical moments, fundamentally reshaping the regional balance of power in China's favor. Number 1. China. China earns the top position not for abandoning the Philippines, Beijing never pretended friendship, but for systematically exploiting every other nation's betrayal while escalating its own aggressive actions throughout 2026 to unprecedented levels. As traditional Philippine allies retreated or remained silent, China interpreted this diplomatic isolation as explicit permission for territorial expansion and economic coercion that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The escalation began immediately and methodically. China declared administrative districts covering disputed reefs in the Spratly Islands, complete with appointed Chinese mayors, official postal codes, taxation systems, and local governance structures. These weren't symbolic gestures. Chinese officials began issuing building permits, collecting taxes from Chinese fishing vessels, and establishing permanent administrative presence on artificial islands built on submerged reefs. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, now operating with explicit military escort, began systematically boarding Philippine fishing vessels in undisputed Filipino territorial waters. Unlike previous harassment that involved water cannons and ramming, 2026 saw direct seizure of vessels, confiscation of fishing equipment worth millions of pesos, and arrest of Filipino crew members under newly implemented Chinese fishing laws that applied Chinese domestic regulations to international waters. China's economic warfare intensified with surgical precision. Beijing imposed strict quotas on rare earth mineral exports essential for Philippine electronics manufacturing, citing environmental protection while offering preferential access to nations supporting Chinese territorial claims. Chinese banks restricted credit for Philippine infrastructure projects unless they included Chinese construction companies operating under Beijing-approved designs and timelines. The diplomatic offensive proved equally systematic and ruthless. China leveraged its newfound economic partnerships with former Philippine allies to block international criticism of its territorial expansion at every institutional level. When the Philippines requested United Nations support for investigating Chinese environmental damage to coral reefs, damage verified by satellite imagery, Beijing mobilized its new European and Asian partners to prevent meaningful resolutions from reaching voting stages. Cultural and information warfare accompanied physical territorial expansion throughout the region. Chinese media companies, now operating throughout Southeast Asia through partnerships with accommodating governments, promoted sophisticated narratives depicting Philippine territorial claims as American manipulation designed to maintain colonial influence. Educational programs funded by Chinese corporations began teaching regional histories that legitimized Chinese territorial claims while systematically minimizing centuries of documented Filipino maritime activity and cultural presence. The human cost escalates daily, with devastating consequences for ordinary Filipino families. Filipino fishermen face arrest, physical intimidation, and violence for accessing waters their families have fished for generations without interference. Overseas Filipino workers in China-aligned nations experience increased discrimination and dramatically reduced legal protections as their homeland becomes isolated diplomatically and economically. Most ominously, China's 2026 actions establish dangerous precedents for territorial expansion globally. By successfully exploiting Allied betrayals and international silence, Beijing demonstrates that sustained economic pressure combined with military intimidation can achieve territorial objectives without triggering meaningful international response, a lesson that authoritarian powers worldwide are studying carefully. As we conclude this sobering countdown, the harsh reality becomes unmistakably clear. 2026 has revealed the fundamentally fragile nature of international solidarity when nations face existential economic pressures and domestic political survival. From Canada's tariff-driven pivot to China's brazen exploitation of Philippine diplomatic isolation, we've witnessed how quickly decades of partnership, shared values, and mutual commitments can dissolve under pressure. The numbers tell the story starkly. 12 nations that supported Philippine territorial claims in January 2026 became 3 by year's end. Billions in promised military aid disappeared. Joint exercises were cancelled. Diplomatic statements became meaningless platitudes. The cascade effect of abandonment created the exact power vacuum that China needed to advance its territorial ambitions without meaningful resistance. Yet this story isn't merely about betrayal. It's fundamentally about resilience and the enduring strength of the Filipino spirit. Throughout history, our people have survived Spanish colonization, American occupation, Japanese invasion, martial law, and countless natural disasters through unity, ingenuity, and unwavering determination to control our own destiny. The challenges of 2026 demand similar resilience on a global scale, but also force necessary questions about our strategic future. Perhaps this isolation compels overdue reconsiderations. Should the Philippines rely so heavily on external security guarantees that evaporate during crises? Can ASEAN unity provide viable alternatives to great power patronage? Do we possess the economic and military capabilities to defend our sovereignty independently? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're essential ones. The Filipino diaspora, 12 million strong across 6 continents, represents both our greatest vulnerability and our greatest strategic asset. When traditional allies abandon diplomatic support, overseas Filipino communities become crucial advocates, economic contributors, and bridges between cultures. Their remittances, totaling $36 billion annually, provide more economic security than any military alliance. History suggests that nations forced into isolation often discover unexpected sources of strength and innovation. Singapore's expulsion from Malaysia catalyzed extraordinary development. Israel's regional isolation spurred technological advancement. Perhaps Philippine isolation will force the long-overdue development of genuine, strategic autonomy and regional leadership that our geography and population deserve. The question isn't whether we can survive these betrayals. We will, because we must. The question is whether we'll learn from this painful experience to build more resilient partnerships, stronger institutions, and genuine strategic independence that doesn't depend on the fluctuating goodwill of distant capitals. What do you think? Can the Philippines forge a new path toward genuine strategic autonomy? Or are we destined to remain dependent on great powers whose loyalty shifts with their economic interests? Share your thoughts below. And if this analysis opened your eyes to the complex realities of international relations, share it with someone who needs to understand why geography, economics, and power matter more than promises in the unforgiving world of geopolitics.